And here I am about to bring a new life into the world.
Mm.
And I wanted to understand more clearly, how does all of this stuff apply to the moment we're living in and how to build a better future for our children?
Mm.
And so this is the other aim of the book, is not only to help people have a more firm and solid inner foundation from which to engage and meet this really complicated, difficult world we're living in, but also to help make some of those connections and provide some clarity about how do we engage more effectively? What are the actual skills that we need to have in our own lives in order to be responsible, powerful citizens and community members?
And hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're sitting down with a repeat guest, Oren Jay Sofer. Oren has written a new book that I highly recommend. The book is called Your Heart Was Made for This. Subtitle is Contemplative Practices for Meeting a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. And so, Oren, welcome back to the show. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this book. It's a true gift.
Awesome. Happy to be here, Glenn.
Thank you. So, real quick, before we jump in, you are a new dad. We just talked about this before we hit record. Tell us, because I think last time you were here, I don't remember. I don't even think this was on the radar at all. So, tell us how are things going?
What great and hard. Parenting is a rite of passage, and
Hmm.
I feel blessed to have the opportunity to learn from my son and from my wife. And I also feel really grateful that I have 25 years of meditation practice to draw from, both in terms of having a little bit more patience and perspective, but also a lot more access to forgiveness and understanding for myself and my wife when we fall short.
Yeah,
And yeah, it pushes me like nothing else ever has, and I really value that opportunity to grow as hard as it can be in times. And it's also been incredibly affirming
mm,
to see the joy and the wonder and the presence and the generosity that are innate in us as human beings when the conditions are supportive to blossom. And so
yeah.
that's just been really nourishing for me to see all of that beauty coming out of our child.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think what you said just a moment ago about kind of being gentle with yourself. I feel like that's something that being a parent has taught me, because it's easy to go to bed at night and let your mind run through of all the things.
Yeah.
Why did I react that way? Why did I do that? Why didn't I spend more
Hmm.
time with this? And
Yeah.
if you go there, you can go deep down a rabbit hole. But having that awareness to kind of step back and give yourself some grace and realize that, I did the best I could in the moment, and perhaps I could do
Exactly.
it differently next time, but I did the best I could.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So before we jump into the book, can you give us maybe a brief overview of the work? Because there's a lot going on here. And I mentioned before we hit record that I thought the book was going to be one thing. And
Mm.
then when I got it, it was something entirely different. So when I got it, I thought to myself, oh, like this is easy. I could read this in a week, because I read a lot of books for the podcast, do a lot of skimming, things like that. So then I started reading. And in the intro, you said that a good approach to take might be to actually spend 1 to 2 weeks with each chapter, as each chapter kind of explores a different quality that can aid us in showing up each day in love, courage, and integrity, as the subtitle says. And so there's a lot here. The chapters are jammed with like all this information, contemplative practices, reflection questions, action points, like so many different things. So all that to say, what is this book? Where did it come from, like in your heart, in your life, and who is this book for?
Thank you. Yeah. So I intended this book as a companion for people in their day-to-day lives. It's really a practical roadmap for how to get our inner kit together for a world that is increasingly complex, stressful, and confusing.
Mhm.
So much is changing so quickly. There is so much heartache and possibility that we are living through during this historical period early in the century. And contemplative practice offers a very powerful and unique kind of medicine
Mm.
for our hearts and our minds and our consciousness. And I feel like it gets relegated to the realm of spirituality and religion and a kind of even just self care and wellness.
Mhm.
But I see it as an indispensable and practical companion for not only surviving, but being able to contribute more effectively. So, my aim in writing the book, I started writing it in 2020 when we all had that shit show of a year with the
Yep.
pandemic, George Floyd, wildfires out west. And I, as a meditation teacher, one of the things that I could offer were practical instructions and inspiration for how to rediscover and draw on our inner resources, things like courage, faith, energy, gratitude, generosity, compassion for ourselves, as we were just talking about, as well as for others. And that was what started the book. And then within a year, my wife and I were pregnant, which took the book to a whole nother level as I looked ahead to the next generation and thought about this very deep question for me of, hey, I've spent the last 25 years of my life, pretty much my whole adult life, practicing, studying, and teaching meditation, communication, these inner skills, this relational exploration. And here I am about to bring a new life into the world.
Mm.
And I wanted to understand more clearly, how does all of this stuff apply to the moment we're living in and how to build a better future for our children?
Mm.
And so this is the other aim of the book, is not only to help people have a more firm and solid inner foundation from which to engage and meet this really complicated, difficult world we're living in, but also to help make some of those connections and provide some clarity about how do we engage more effectively? What are the actual skills that we need to have in our own lives in order to be responsible, powerful citizens and community members? And so that's the hope of this book, and it's really for anyone who's paying attention and is
Mm.
concerned,
Mhm.
about everything in our world. And I don't offer one prescription. I
Mhm.
think that is simple-minded and short-sighted. More, I'm wanting people to have a really flexible and robust toolkit inside so that each person can apply it in the way that makes sense to them.
Yeah. Where did you come up with these 20, I think there's 26
Hmm.
skills or practices in the book? Like what made the list? Like were these
Yeah.
things that you have like thought back over your life and over your own,
Yeah.
time in these kind of spaces? Were there any that kind of got left out of the list that maybe you were going to add in there?
Yeah, yeah, there are. So the list of 26, which seems like a kind of a random number. The way I came up with that number, as you know from the introduction, is if you do 2 weeks for each chapter, that gives
Mhm.
you a whole year. And even though the chapters are, packed with practices and information and reflections, they're also pretty short,
Yep.
10, 12 pages. So the idea is that this is something we can actually do in our life, in our busy, busy world.
Mhm.
So I came up with the qualities. A lot of them are drawn from classical Buddhist teachings. The Buddhist tradition was an oral tradition before it was written down, and so you end up with all of these lists of different powerful traits that are necessary on the spiritual path. And so I took a step back and I looked at all those lists and I started pulling out common themes
Mhm.
from the lists. And then I also looked at my own life and all of the students and practitioners I've worked with over the years, both meditators and also people learning to communicate, people wanting to bring more compassion and integrity and nonviolence into their work, whether it's as mediators, human rights lawyers, police officers. I've worked with people from all different walks of life. And I thought, what are the skills that people need?
Mm,
And so those were the criteria I was looking at. Most of the chapters can be traced back to Buddhist lists, although as you look down the table of contents, I think what one recognizes is that these are universal
mhm,
humanistic qualities, things like generosity or gratitude or integrity. These are things that we value in human society and communities across different traditions and cultures. And I also wanted to include things that I found meaningful in my own life and that I see are relevant for our world, something like wonder
mm,
or play.
yeah,
These are not things that you find explicitly in the Buddhist teachings that I'm trained in, but that are clearly essential to a robust and rich human life, and that are also important to sustain us
yeah.
in difficult times. And so, what gets left out? Well, of course, there's always more to say than there is space. So, I acknowledge that there's qualities like, say, humility
Mm, mhm,
or humor
mhm,
or surrender. However, and I talk about this in the introduction, those qualities they're adjacent to other ones and they show
yeah,
up in different ways. So humor shows up in the chapter on play, and
mhm.
humility shows up in the chapter on renunciation and simplicity. So they don't get their own chapter, but they're folded in there.
Exactly. They run parallel, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you give us a maybe like for our listeners an example? Take us into maybe one of these skills that has been most important to you in your
Mhm.
life, and your journey. Maybe talk a little bit about that particular skill. Maybe like one of the practices or two that you mentioned there, just to kind of give our listeners a taste of what to expect if they
Yeah.
pick up this book and they jump in.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just start with the one that's kind of the top of my own mind right now, because it's
Mhm.
one that I've been exploring and practicing with a lot, and that's courage.
Mm,
Um, I think it takes tremendous courage to open our eyes and our hearts to the realities that we are living through, whether we're talking about the ecological crisis, the disintegration of democratic structures in our society. I don't need to run down the list, right?
there's a lot of yeah.
There's a lot of things going on, and it's really easy, to just not want to get out of bed in the morning or bury our head in the sand or just put our head down and I'm just going to focus on what's right in front of me and not deal with the rest of that stuff because it's so overwhelming. So
Yeah.
this is one of the themes that runs through the book is how do we find the right balance so that we're not overwhelmed and flooded.
Mhm.
We're able to focus on the things that we can do and not overly stressed with things that are really beyond our control. One central aspect of that is courage. Why? Because we can't actually engage with or change anything if we're not willing to face it first,
Mm,
if we're not willing to actually countenance it. So, one of the personal examples I give at the very beginning of the chapter, since we've already talked about it, was for me, I had to really dig deep to have a kid. Took a lot of courage inside to bring a child into a world that is so changing and uncertain,
yeah.
um, but also to recognize the excruciating vulnerability of loving a being that ultimately we can't protect, that ultimately we need to let go of. I went into this experience as a meditator with open eyes about the excruciating potential for risk and loss inherent
Mm,
in having children, and that takes courage. And I commend all parents everywhere for the courage it takes to love, which is to risk loss. So this is just a personal example. So how do we develop courage, and what is it, right? So we need to distinguish between courage and fear. We often think of courage as not feeling fear,
Mhm.
I think that's one of the misunderstandings of courage. Courage is actually the willingness to move forward and act in spite of fear.
Mhm.
And we need to understand that sometimes fear is a really natural and healthy signal to danger that we can respond to, but that there's a difference between, say, um, a kind of healthy reservation and fear and panicking
Mhm.
or freezing, right? Our mind can amplify a threat, blow it out of proportion, and then we become less available to actually help or respond. So,
Mhm.
courage starts by stepping back, taking a pause with mindfulness, recognizing what's happening, and then getting some perspective, actually distinguishing between what's actual, what am I adding, right? So, awareness gives us that possibility to pause, ground, take a breath without fear, letting over. And then the courage comes from the word core, right? Which means heart. So it's meeting life with a full heart, meeting life
Mhm.
on its own terms rather than through the lens of what we want or what we think should be.
Mhm.
So, how do we develop courage? This is where we need to understand the importance of working within our own capacities
Mhm.
and also being able to stretch. So, one of the principles I talk about in the beginning of the book is a trauma informed approach to developing these traits and qualities is to start small, work in manageable bits, and find what gets known in different fields as the stretch zone, the zone of
Mhm.
strategic discomfort, right? It's like just a little beyond your capacity, but not so far beyond that you're overwhelmed
Mhm.
or distraught. So for courage, for example, it's like don't when you start thinking about, okay, how do I have more courage in my life? You need to know where you are first, right? Like what what's too far ahead? What's the thing that I want to have courage to look at or engage with, but it feels overwhelming. Don't start
Mhm.
there.
Mhm.
Um, and look back at your life and say, okay, where have I felt courage? Where have I known courage? Where just even in the smallest ways, I had the courage to ask for something I wanted.
Mhm.
I had the courage to speak up in a meeting and say, I'm a little concerned about this. I don't think it's going to work.
Mhm.
And then we connect with how that felt. Know the place inside where you already have courage, and then look for what's the next thing. What's the next thing that's just a little beyond where I'm at that I want to have courage for? Maybe it's having a conversation with your spouse or a family member about something that's been bothering you that you've been avoiding bringing up that you think they might be open to, but you're a little uneasy about it.
Mhm.
It's a good place to start. That kind of feeling. We identify where we have it, we identify what the next step is, and then we work towards it and develop it. And then there are
Mhm.
practices in the chapter for how to do that with a reflection, say a meditation, or the kind of action of choosing something specific, setting a time frame, taking some steps towards it, perhaps even telling someone else about it so that you've got an accountability buddy.
Yeah. I love that. I love that chapter because when I was reading it, I was thinking back to my
Hmm.
daughter when she started first grade. She was
Mm,
extremely scared. Like she loved
yeah.
kindergarten, had a
Hmm.
blast. And then she was all excited for first grade, but we got to like the day before the class started, you get to go see the classroom, meet the teacher, and she
Yeah.
realized like this is a different room, which I don't think
Uh,
that had registered till we walked in. It's a different room. And so we
right.
walked further down the hallway to the left instead of the right. And her regular teachers weren't in there from obviously kindergarten. There's some new kids now in the mix because they mix up the classes when they go to the next grade. And so she realized that everything is familiar because the building is the same, but everything is really unfamiliar. So
Yeah.
after we did that, we went to the playground and we were sitting
Hmm.
there. She didn't want to play. She sat off to the side,
Mm,
staring at the ground. Like I could see the fear in her eyes. And I said to her, I said,
mm,
Jordan, I said, what's going on? And she said, nothing.
yeah.
I was like, well, something's going on. You could talk to me about it. So I'm just really
Hmm.
scared about
Mm,
school. And so
yeah.
that night when we got her home, my
Hmm.
wife sat her down at the table and we did this thing called the mind table. And we
Ooh.
told her like it's okay to be afraid. Everybody's afraid. Everybody gets scared. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And that's fine. And being courageous, like you said, is about moving forward in spite of that
Yeah.
fear. And at the mind table, you have all these different feelings inside. You have your happy feelings, your sad feelings, your angry feelings. And
Mhm.
every once in a while, one of those feelings will take a seat at the head of the table and try to control the
Mm.
whole conversation. And so right
Wow.
now it seems like fear is really taking over. But
Yeah.
then my wife said to her, remember what happened last year in kindergarten? You were really scared the first day, but by the
Yeah.
second, third day, you didn't even want to come home. You just wanted to sleep
Mhm.
there. You were so excited. And then she started to remember back to that. I think that helped
Mm.
her. But I think to your point with this idea of courage, like you said,
Yeah.
it's not about not being afraid. It's about
Yeah.
stepping forward in spite of the fear, but
Right.
remembering back to those other times when you
Yes.
were afraid and everything worked out and came together.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Glenn. That's really touching. And I love that image. It's one I, might even use. This reminds me of that movie Inside Out, right? Where
Yeah,
the
right.
emotions get personified. But one of the things I
Yep.
love about the story you just told is this this connection between our own capacity for courage with our own feelings and our own situations allows us to impart that, inspire that, and be there for others,
Yep.
right? Particularly as a parent, it's like our ability to have courage with our own challenges then allows us to kind of be there for our children in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. I mentioned before we hit record that this book has been meaningful for me in
Hmm.
what in the way that it is that I didn't think it was going to be has been most meaningful to me in my life. And I wanted to share with you a little bit just kind of about what's been
Please.
going on in my life and how
Yeah,
this
I'd
book
love
has been
to.
speaking to. And I thought maybe you could respond to it because
Mm.
I feel that probably I'm not the only one going through this sort of thing, but I'm in this place where like obviously there's individual crisis like you mentioned earlier and there's like collective crisis, right? There's like our
Yes.
individual problems and there's the worldwide huge problems. And part of me feels like I was thinking about this the other day. I was writing in my journal. And I feel like I feel like I'm like this crazy person sometimes because I'm like emotionally exhausted from both of these things. Like my father passed
Mm.
away back in March, and similar to an experience that you describe in the book, I very quickly became aware that I was almost like addicted to avoiding my feelings, in particular, like the heavier feelings, of grief. And for
Yeah.
me, that's what I picked up. That's what I learned to do in church ministry because in church ministry, like as a pastor, it's kind of like ingrained in you. It's maybe not spoken to you, but there's like this unwritten kind of rule that everybody's more important than me. And so
Mm.
if you feel grief, you feel sadness, you feel anger, whatever, you jam
Hmm.
that down and you stuff it away because you have to get on, with the work of the church. There's sermons to write, there's Bible
Hmm.
studies to lead, there's sick people that you've got to visit, there's
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
grieving people that you have to help kind of make it through, their situation. So when my
Hmm.
dad passed away, I was like,
Hmm.
I can't live like that anymore.
Hmm.
That's just not a good way to live my life. Like I need to access these feelings. I
Hmm.
don't even remember the last time I cried, so I was like, I have to figure out like where have I locked these feelings up? I have to be able to access them. So I went on this journey to really kind of embrace the feelings as they came instead of like jamming them away. Like
Yeah.
whenever they came up, I just told myself I'm going to just embrace them in the moment. But then we have like collective crisis, right? And you speak
Hmm.
like in the book of the climate crisis. We have the war with Israel and Palestine. We have all the drama surrounding the election that's going to be coming up. We have, shootings going on all the time. When I drop my daughter off at school every morning, it crosses my mind, and that creates some level of anxiety. There's
Yeah.
nuclear war that they're always threatening, all these different things.
Right.
If you're on the
Right.
news, like you never know what's
Yeah.
going to happen. You're not on the
Right.
news. And then go back to individual. Like I feel like, holidays at the time of recording are here. This is the first holiday without my
It's
dad.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have birthdays coming up in the spring, and he's not going to be here for those things. And like all these
Hmm.
moments that were once all happiness, it feels like there's this cloud of loss and grief that's
Hmm.
kind of covering. So on any given day, like I said before, I just feel like I'm all over the place. And I can't
Hmm.
tell you how many times, or and I've had to have like a podcast we're going to record, and I've had to reach out to the person like an hour before and just like, I'm just not in a place to do it today because I don't have the mental energy to string
Yeah.
together like a coherent thought. And
Yeah.
so individual and collective grief crisis. I guess my question
Yes.
would be like, how can these practices speak to both? Do they speak to each of these in the same way? Do they change a
Mm.
little bit for individual, collective? And then even more than that, like how do you even know on a given day, what crisis is affecting you the most? Because like for me, some days I wake up and I'm thinking about my dad,
Yeah,
but then I'm also thinking about something that's going on in the world or in
right.
our culture or whatever it might be. And I feel like that creates anxiety. And then it all gets jumbled up together. And I
Yeah,
almost don't know which one needs to be addressed
yeah.
first, if that makes any sense.
It makes complete sense, Glenn. Yeah, and yeah, maybe just to start, just my tender, just want to offer my tender heart to you. I think I think we had some correspondence when we scheduled the podcast about the fact that, both of our fathers passed this year. Sounds like within a month of one another.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I can really relate
Thank you.
to everything you shared. Um and I just love that you shared that, just that little tidbit around having what I see as, kind of the courage and the integrity to cancel plans. Right?
Yeah.
It takes a tremendous amount of strength to, I think, to
Mm,
be real and vulnerable and be like, yeah, I'm not going to get it together
yeah.
because my heart's more important than pushing myself and
Yeah.
overriding my limits.
Yeah.
Um, so to speak to your question, how do these practices apply to individual and collective grief? How can we tease those apart? Are there
Mm,
differences in how they apply? Mm. It's such a beautiful question. Um, I think that there are differences in how we apply them because the scale of the grief is different.
mm,
Um, but I think that they inform each other, so like grieving the loss of a loved one
mm,
it teaches us something important about so much, but it teaches us how to grieve.
mhm,
Um, and one of the things I talk about, like in the chapter on wonder, for example, um, is sometimes I feel like we can close our heart or pull away from opening to some of the beauty or the joy or the wonder in life because it will put us in touch with what we have lost.
mm,
So, like on a collective level, the more we open to the beauty and the wonder of nature,
mhm,
it's inevitable that we will feel and encounter the grief of species extinction and ecosystems being strained or decimated and the various manifestations of the climate crisis.
mm,
So I think the application of the qualities it can look different. We're cultivating them internally as a foundation and kind of a compass, but then how they show up and get applied is going to look differently. So, for example, take something like the ecological crisis. Um, I think the application of a quality like, say, wonder or courage, and having space to grieve, that's going to look different in my mind, right?
mhm,
We're talking about a collective experience, and then I think it's important to actually have spaces where we can both celebrate and honor the our connection, our intimate relationship with the natural world, and
mhm,
also mourn and grieve, whether it's just with a friend or with a community, a group, or whether it's through ritual or doing something to honor the beautiful places we've known or lost. So I think it could show up differently in how it gets applied.
mm.
But the second part of your question really interests me, which is, can we tease these apart? How do we
Yeah.
tease these apart? I was just reflecting about this morning. It's been a hard year for me, and I often feel like my book challenges me today to it's like, okay, great, I wrote this book, and it's based on all of my years of experience, and I'm still learning from it, right? I'm still
Mhm,
applying it. It's like I'm grieving my dad, I'm grieving the war between Israel and Hamas, I'm you know, challenged in my marriage and my relation, being a parent in ways that are natural and expected, and it's still hard. And so, how do I make sense of all of that? And what I'm working with in that process is first just this question or maybe two questions of like, what's true
Mm,
right now in this moment? What's true? And then the next question is what's needed
mm,
right now in this moment, what's needed, and so sometimes what's true is it's just like my heart hurts
mhm,
and I feel confused, and I don't need the answer, and I don't need the program. It's like what's needed is just to honor that, right? And so I think that one aspect of distinguishing is this capacity to look carefully and honor the truth of our experience,
mm,
and then just take the next step, right? And we all have different agreements in our lives with those
mm,
around us and our responsibilities, and so I feel like the more we can do that, the more space we start to have to be in right relationship with what's true for us and the relationships that we have with others in our lives. It's like I don't need to resolve everything in my heart and have it all tied up and clear in order to be present for my son or
yeah,
available for my wife and so forth. But if I just push it away and avoid it, now I'm actually not in integrity with myself.
mhm,
And I've shut off to a certain part of my heart. So I'm actually less available
yeah,
for those that I love. So it starts there. And then I think there's a need to also, it's not just asking what do I need in the moment, but it's some sense of looking ahead and really is okay, well, what do I need broadly?
mm,
And oftentimes I think a lot of what we need is rest and time. We need, because the questions that we're facing and the feelings we have about what we're going through individually and collectively are massive, and there aren't simple answers. It's more about finding a way to articulate the questions in a meaningful way for us, and then living in relationship to those questions in a way that is that has integrity.
yeah,
And I think that it's difficult to recognize oftentimes that the lens through which we are seeing the challenges of our world is clouded.
mm,
It's not clear. It's actually that very lens, the way we even think about the problems we have, has been shaped by the forces of society, by capitalism, by um, modernity, by various power dynamics. And so there's a certain humility to come back to that quality of just sort of how can I not turn away from these questions, but engage with them in a way that's meaningful and has some integrity.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's a kind of a lot of different pieces there, but I hope it touches on some of what you're asking about.
Yeah, no, it definitely doesn't. I love what you said about it, not compartmentalizing things, because I know for myself, like it's easy, especially in this season of grief that I've been in. I found that my inclination was to put my grief in a box until later.
Yeah,
Like I'm gonna embrace it, but just not right now. And so I'm just gonna put it
right.
in the box and push it away so I can do what I have to do, whether it's
Yeah.
focus on being present for my daughter or being
Mm-hmm.
present
Mm-hmm.
for, a podcast or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
there's been something really, it's been very hard, it's been very heavy, very difficult, but something really freeing, and
Mm,
kind of letting that grief out of the box to kind of
mm,
come and make its way into just the everyday, day to day type things, like even just with my daughter. She's only 6, but like there's been so many moments where it's been me and her alone for the whole day, and that can be trying. It could be difficult when you're trying to work from home, you're trying to do a lot
yeah.
of different things, and you're trying to give your focus to a lot of things at once. And so many times I want to take that grief and jam it away, but I've actually
Mm,
let it come out. And my daughter said to me, like, "Daddy, is there something wrong? And I've said to her, like, I'm just really struggling with, grandpa not being here and things like that. And to see
Mm,
her,
mm,
then what that does to her and how she then is able to kind of enter into that sphere and to kind of come in with
mhm,
her own words of encouragement and see her own heart
mm,
come alive has been
mm.
really an interesting thing to watch, but I would never have experienced that if I would have just jammed the grief away
Yeah,
and got on with my life. So I feel like letting everything kind of come together as one, so to speak, has really opened up a lot of different doors that I wouldn't have seen had I wanted to separate all that stuff.
that's beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks,
Yeah.
Glenn.
So what would you say like are the maybe some best practices for people to take the ideas in this book and put them into practice? Because you say in the book that there's readers are going to be on a spectrum of different familiarity with these things. Some people are going to be more advanced, so to speak. Maybe they've been doing a lot of meditation. They've been really into contemplative
Mhm,
practices. So they're going to kind of pick up this book and be like, yes, you're
mhm,
speaking my language. Whereas other people will pick it up and be like, what in the world is this guy talking about? Like, there's so many new ideas that are here, but yet the book is for everybody. It really is. Like, I feel like everybody can sink their teeth in it, so to speak, and really apply some different things. So what would be your advice in terms of like best practices? You say in the beginning, like we said about maybe
yeah,
taking a week or two with each
yeah,
chapter. What does that
yeah,
look like? Like, is it reading the chapter multiple times? Is it really honing
mhm,
in on one particular piece depending on where you are? Like, what are those best practices look like for you? If you could
sure.
wish people to take those things away, what would they be?
Yeah, thanks. Um, well, let's start with one of the foundational principles in
Mhm,
the book, which is one that I know you're well familiar with just from your own training and life and practice, which is that we're always practicing something.
mhm,
Every day, there's what we're doing,
mhm,
whether it's parenting or working or tidying, there's what we're doing, but then there's how we're doing it.
yeah,
And the how is what we're practicing.
mm,
So how are we living? Because that's what we get good at. So we might get good at, to touch on a theme that we were just talking about, we might get really good at compartmentalizing and disconnecting from aspects of our heart or our experience in order to function. Or we could get really good at being a whole human being and modeling for those around us what it is to have the strength to be real
mm,
with what it is to be human and who we are.
mm,
We can get really good at rushing and being fragmented and distracted, which is what everything in our society is trying to get us to do. Or we can get really good at being um, wholeheartedly present in every moment,
mm,
which doesn't mean moving slowly. We can be moving quickly, getting a lot done, but not be fragmented,
yeah,
not be frenzied or
all
frantic.
over the place. Yeah.
Exactly. So, how are we living? We're always practicing something. So, this is the central theme to bear in mind every day.
Mm,
Not just what do I need to get done today, but how do I want to get it done? How do I want to live? How do I want to be present for myself, for those around me,
yeah,
and for this miraculous blessing of being born on a planet such as this?
yeah,
How do I want to do that? So that's the question we're learning to bear in mind.
mm,
All of the practices in the book are designed to move from that awareness and then hone in on different capacities.
yeah,
So, this is the first principle. The second
mhm,
principle is that if you want to get better at being a whole human being
mhm,
and integrating all the different parts of ourselves and embodying the best of what's available to us, our potential, you need to pay attention. we have to be able we have to be able to pay attention to what's happening inside and out. Otherwise, we are just dragged along by our habits and by the demands and notifications of the world around us. So
yep,
how are we using our attention? Can we reclaim our attention? So
I think
So the
that's
book's
chapter 1 too, isn't it? I
that's
think
chapter
yeah,
one.
that's where you gotta begin.
That's why the book starts there. You can't do anything else if you're not paying attention. Otherwise, we're
Yeah.
just on automatic. So we need to be able to first cultivate a little bit of attention. So how do we do that? And then from there,
Mhm.
how do we turn towards whatever particular quality we feel is needed and that we want to benefit from? And this is where I really hope people reading the book feel empowered to skip around,
Mhm.
and look through and be like, oh yeah, I could really use a little joy in my life right now. Let's go ahead to that chapter, or gosh, I've just been feeling so jaded and,
Mhm.
cynical. I could use some kindness, I want to sort of soften things up. So reading the chapter is a place to start.
Mhm.
They're short enough that hopefully one can read it within a few days. My sense is read it at a pace that feels relaxing, enjoyable. And if you get to a passage that like really lands with you, you read something like, oh wow, that makes a lot of sense. I just stop there and just stay with that for the
Yeah.
day to the next day until you're ready to actually move on. And then the basic practice, and many of the practices in the book are variations on this. They're different ways of working with, but the basic practice is we want to identify what is the trait I want to cultivate? What's the way of being in the world, in my life, with others, with myself that I want to strengthen and have better access to?
Mm.
So let's say it's something like contentment.
Mhm.
I want to feel less frenzied and always chasing after something, and a little bit more content. Or even something like concentration. I want to be more focused, less fragmented. So the first step is to actually touch into the place where that, just like we're talking about with courage.
Mhm.
All of these qualities are things that we already have experienced. None of them are foreign to us. These are innate human abilities that can be strengthened. So we have to start from what we know. We find a way to connect with it. And that's where the creativity of contemplative practice comes in.
Mhm.
And the point that I make in the book is that there's so many ways to do this. Meditation is just one.
Mhm.
Just like there are lots of ways to exercise, and running is just one way of exercising. If you don't like to run, you can still exercise.
Mhm.
If you don't like to, or you don't want to meditate, it's not the right, form for you, no problem.
Mhm.
So identify the quality, know how you experience it, where you felt it or noted in your life. And then how do I remember that?
Mm.
How do I actually create a connection in my mind? How do I strengthen those neural networks? How do I send a little bit of mental energy down that track? It's, oh, yeah, that's what it's like to feel content.
Yeah.
That moment after I finish eating a meal where I just sit back and go, ah,
Mm.
right? Or the first sip of coffee of the day, or first sip of a hot drink, and you go,
Yeah.
and there's that moment of contentment. It's fleeting. It's based on sensory stimulation. Fine, doesn't matter. It's actually a moment of contentment.
Mhm.
So you identify that experience, and then you want to create an association. You want to create a way of remembering it, of coming back to it, an image, a word, um, even a certain position. Maybe for contentment, maybe you interlace your fingers together, and you feel like, oh, that feels good. That feels like it reminds my whole body of what it's like to be content. Or
Mhm.
concentration,
Yeah.
you have an image of somebody, a moment where you're really concentrated, or a certain gesture that you can make with your hands. So you identify a way of connecting with it. And then throughout the day, and this is where the mindfulness practice supports us, as often as we can,
Mhm.
how do you come back to that? How do
Yeah.
you how do you just set a little reminders, a little pause here and there to come back to that touchstone for, this is how I'm wanting to live today. This is the skill I'm wanting to develop. This is the way of being I'm trying to encourage in myself. And just little by little, it builds up slowly, every day, a little bit, a little bit. And that's why I feel like it's important to take it slowly. We don't have to rush through the book. There's so much other
Yeah.
things to do in life. So it's like, fine, just focus on concentration for a week or two. Focus on just
Yeah.
being like really present with just one thing. And if you give yourself actually a week or two to come back to that, it'll grow, it'll
Yeah.
strengthen.
Yeah. What I love too, and you alluded to this before, is that it's not, this is a toolkit, right? It's a tool belt.
Mhm.
Not every practice is necessarily going to feel like it applies to every situation, but it's a matter of having these different things in your belt. So when you come across a particular issue or crisis, whatever in your life, you have these different things to pull from. They're able
Right.
to use in the moment. So I think for me, like I'm that person who likes to master everything. It's just like the way that I feel like I'm wired. And
Yeah.
a lot of your teachings, and I've talked to people like Sebene Selassie has been on the
Yeah.
show, and like
Yeah.
a lot of you have really taught me to kind of slow down and realize that you don't have to master everything at once. You can just take
Mhm.
it slowly and you can just try to apply what is needed for the moment
That's
in
right.
the moment.
And the beauty of that, Glenn, is that, these qualities, even though there's like a chapter on each and different
Yeah.
practices, they're all connected,
Yeah.
right? So, for example, if we're practicing concentration, let's say, which I mention that one because I feel like it is a skill that is so sorely lacking in our world today because of the influence of technology and the pace of our lives and the attention economy and
Yeah.
all of those factors. And it's one that is not only incredibly helpful in
Mm.
terms of being effective, it's actually one that's really healing.
Mm.
To be focused in a wholehearted and relaxed way, um, it feels great.
Yeah.
When we're in the zone with something, it's like, oh, it feels so good to just be in my groove and be able to give my attention and my energy to something like that feels
Yeah.
really nourishing for us. So if we're practicing concentration, if
Mm.
we're using the skills and the tips that I offer in the chapter there, guess what? We're also practicing letting go.
Mm.
We're practicing contentment.
Yeah.
We're practicing ease.
Yeah.
We're practicing curiosity. Like all of those are factors that are necessary and support concentration. So they're all present, they're all coming
Yeah.
in.
That's
It's
true.
just that the one that's in the front, the facet we're focusing on is the concentration. And so
Yeah.
it's like that with many of the qualities. The whole is greater than the
Yeah.
sum of the parts. So we
Yeah.
just choose what's needed, and the other ones come along naturally as we
Mm.
practice.
And I guess the more you work on one, you kind of strengthen your ability in the others, right? And so then you work on one over here, you really strengthen something over here as well. So eventually they all start to really come together to make one massive tool belt.
They do, and it's even better than that in a way because it's not just what you said, which is the more you practice one, the more you're strengthening the others, and then you're kind of able to move adjacent. And
Hmm.
but actually, the more you practice any of them,
Yeah.
we get we get better at the process of practicing.
Mm.
It's like that underlying mechanism of training our heart and mind
Mm.
to embody the fullness of what we have access to as human beings, that gets stronger.
Yeah.
The very
Mm.
mechanism of shaping our inner life gets honed, and then we have this instrument, this capacity that we can start applying to anything.
That's right. That's right. Well, Oren, this has been a lot of fun, but we're just about out of time. But this has been great. Your book is great. You're great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. I appreciate you.
Ditto. You too, Glenn.
And real quick, where can people go to connect more with the book online? Any kind of website you have set up you want to direct people to?
Absolutely. My website, orenjaysofer.com, is a great place to find out more about my work. And the book is available anywhere books are sold. Your
That's
heart
right.
was made for this.
I saw it in my bookstore the other day. It's there.
Awesome. Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, Oren.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.